LSU has its new special teams coach. We'll tell you about him. Locked on LSU. Let's go.
You are Locked On LSU, your daily podcast on the LSU Tigers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Okay, let's get it. It is Locked On LSU, your team every day. I'm your host, Matt Moscona. Thanks so much for making us your first listen. We're free, available wherever you get podcasts, of course, on YouTube as well. So please subscribe. And as always, one of the fastest ways to help us grow is by leaving your comments below. Today's episode brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Game day for the LSU women's basketball team. A top 10 matchup as LSU is at South Carolina. Can the Tigers end that dreadful losing streak? We'll talk about it in a bit. Kendall Rogers, D1 Baseball, the preeminent college baseball voice, stops by the show to give us a little preview not only of LSU, but the SEC as well. But we begin with a little LSU football staff news as Brian Kelly has hired his new special teams coach. And I use that phrasing sort of emphatically, coach, because what has still not been confirmed yet is, well, A, the hire, and B, the role. But what we do know after Football Scoop first reported is that Amon Anand is joining Brian Kelly's staff. Now, Anand spent this past season as the special teams coordinator at Grambling. And I'm going to tell you about Anand's history up until this point. But what is interesting to remember as we talk about LSU staff, there's one full-time on-field staffer who left this offseason, and that was Slade Nagel. Now, Slade Nagel was your tight ends coach and also your special teams coach. But as we've talked about, Bob Diaco, who by title was an analyst, Bob Diaco is the one that was running special teams in 2023 and 2024. Bob Diaco left to go join Bill Belichick's staff at North Carolina. So the question really is, will Anand be joining LSU in the on-field role as a special teams coordinator or in an off-field role like Bob Diaco? Now, what I will tell you in making several phone calls on Thursday is that, number one, while Football Scoop is the first to report it, and LSU is looking to hire Amon Anand, that is not official. There's some formalities that have to happen. You got to go through he would be a state employee, so you have to go through the standard background check and all that sort of stuff. But if he clears all that, then he'll be hired. And I am told he will be hired as an analyst. So this will not be the on-field one of the 10 full-time on-field staff members. So I'll explain what that means here in just a second and what that means and how LSU pieces the rest of the class together or the staff together. But let me first tell you about Amon Anand. So number one, I have tremendous respect for guys like this. Now, if you had asked me 48 hours, who is Amon Anand? Wouldn't have had a clue. Couldn't have told you from Adam, could have picked him out from a lineup of two people. Wouldn't have no idea. So naturally, one of the first things you do is to go start looking through all the biographical info. Who is he? Where did he coach? All this sort of stuff. And one thing is abundantly clear. This dude is a grinder. This dude is someone who loves to coach so much. He has taken the long road. So many people look at coaches and the prestige and the money and all the things that come along with being high-level coaches. And what we often forget is what the build, the slow burn was like to get to that point. People talk about Nick Saban winning 7 national titles. What they don't talk about was, when he was coaching at Toledo in his first head coaching opportunity. People don't often talk about the start. And coaching a lot of times is a war of attrition to get to a point where you can make a livable wage. And they will filter out coaches that aren't in it for the right reasons because it is hard to get by. Exhibit A would be Amon Anand. He started coaching as a student assistant not a grad assistant, a student assistant at the South Dakota School of Mines and Technology. Not MINDS, MINES. I never even heard of South Dakota School of Mines and Technology. He was a student coach at the South Dakota School of Mines and Technology, then went to Old Dominion in 2011. After that, he becomes a grad assistant at 3 different places. I mean, Northern Arizona, Utah State, and Memphis. So he goes from Old Dominion to the South Dakota School of Mines and Technology for 3 years there, 2012, 13, 14. 15, he goes to Northern Arizona. 16 and 17, he's a GA at Utah State. And 18, he's a GA at Memphis. Remember, you'll get paid as a grad assistant. You know, you can work some camps and maybe make a little side money, but you are not a salaried employee when you are a graduate assistant. So from 2011 to 2018, he is making no money coaching at Old Dominion, South Dakota School of Mines and Technology, Northern Arizona, Utah State, Memphis. Then finally breaks through and gets a job as an assistant special teams coach with Baylor and with Penn State. So Penn State and then Baylor. After Baylor, he goes on for a season at Texas Southern, coaching running backs and special teams, and then spent this past season, 2024, at Grambling as the special teams coordinator. So you were talking about a dude that has taken the long road, but now you're talking about going from GA, like South Dakota School of Mines and Technology, to GA at Northern Arizona and Utah, wherever. And then finally you're an assistant at Penn State and like an assistant position coach, not an assistant coach. You are an assistant special teams coach, assistant to the special teams coach. And then Texas Southern and Grambling, and now LSU. So going from the FCS level to an analyst, not just at the FBS level, not just the Power 4, but elite level Power 4, is a springboard breakthrough for him, which is awesome. And congrats to him for it. But what this means, that the fact that he would be joining LSU as an analyst, is that you still have that full-time staff member open because you've got to hire a tight ends coach. Now, when Bob Diaco left LSU, I talked about this. So if you're an everydayer, you heard me say this. This will sound a little repetitive. And if you are an everydayer, thank you for that. But remember, LSU sort of stole an on-field staff job. And it's very legal because analysts can now coach on the field. They can wear headsets during the games, coach during the games. I mean, they can do everything the 10 full-time staff members can do. They just can't go recruit off campus. It's really the only difference. And they're not compensated quite as well. But in any event, you had this guy who was in Bob Diaco, who was a former head coach, former defensive coordinator, special teams coordinator, tons of experience. And you have him on staff as an analyst. He basically is your special teams coordinator. And I know there's a lot of LSU fans that ask, when is Brian Kelly going to hire a full-time special teams coordinator? And I keep repeating, you had a guy that was a former FBS head coach working on your staff as an analyst doing your special teams. I mean, think of it like when Steve Sarkisian was an analyst at Alabama. That's kind of cheating. Not literally. I mean, it's legal. It's totally legal, but you're stealing a spot, basically. You have someone who is totally overqualified for the job. That's what you had in Bob Diaco. And LSU special teams this last year were good. You were third in the country in kickoff returns. You were very good in punt returns with Xavier Thomas this year. Damian Ramos is a 78% field goal kicker for his career. Your bugaboo, and there were a few instances where on field goal, snap hole placement, the whole operation you got a little disjointed. And it's unfortunate because Slade Roy was an incredible long snapper for you. He had a couple of not great ones this year. Peyton Todd was your holder, and that he's holding for the first time this year. So some of that operation got a little wonky, but at the same time, you were overall really good at special teams, especially compared to what you had been prior. where you weren't even trying to return punts. You were just telling your returner, get away so you don't possibly fumble it. Really, you were just not great at punting. Peyton Todd, Blake Oxendorf didn't do well. And as a result, you went to the portal and you're bringing in Grant Chadwick from Middle Tennessee. So I think your personnel is fine. Aaron Burrell was incredible. Was just banging kickoffs through the back of the end zone. Only 8 kickoffs returned against LSU all year. By comparison, LSU returned 29. So your specialists are fine. And I think you were coached pretty well. So you're bringing in another guy who's been around coaching now for 14 years, has mostly coached special teams over 14 years, and you're hiring him as an analyst to coach your special teams. Great. You still have to find a tight ends coach because LSU under Brian Kelly features the tight end. You have got to have someone maintain that position. Your other options would be, do you combine the tight ends and the receivers, which I don't think there's any appetite to do that. When a year ago, Slade Nagel could kind of have a co-role. Mike Denbrock, he was your OC, but also coached your tight ends. You're going to have to hire someone to coach your tight ends. It's too valuable of a position in Brian Kelly's offense to not have someone coaching that position. And if you wanted to hire a tight ends coach and a full-time special teams coordinator, well, then you'd have to let one of your staff members go where you feel it's in excess. And like when I look at the 2 spots, I would go, okay, well, on the defensive line, you've got Bo Davis and Kevin Peoples. I don't want either one of those guys going anywhere. And then you could look in the secondary, and this would be the other spot where you have Corey Raymond coaching corners and Jake Olson coaching safeties. Well, your safeties didn't perform very well last year. And Corey Raymond, for the bulk of his time in Baton Rouge's first go-round, was the secondaries coach. He coached corners and safeties. So do you really want to divvy those up? And if the answer is yes, then this is the way to go. You have a special teams coach who's an analyst, and then you hire a full-time on-field tight ends coach. Listen, you were able to have success in recruiting without a tight ends coach in tow. Slade Nagel had already taken the job at Houston, and you were able to go into the transfer portal and land Donovan Green and Bauer Sharp, and you signed J.D. LaFleur. So you added 3 tight ends in this recruiting cycle, high school and portal, without having a tight ends coach. So clearly there's a lot of trust in Brian Kelly and what he's going to do and how they're going to feature the tight end in the offense, but you got to fill that role. So as I understand it, as I was told on Thursday, Amon Anand is going to join LSU as an analyst to coach special teams, and LSU is still seeking a full-time on-field 10th assistant, which will be a tight ends coach. When that job is filled, we'll certainly let you know. If you got ideas for names, drop them in the comments and let me know who you'd like to see LSU hire. Okay, we'll knock out a quick break. When we come back, Friday, LSU Baseball hits the practice field for the first time in the 2025 season. To get ready for the 2025 season, we'll let you hear from Kendall Rogers of D1 Baseball, the preeminent college baseball voice, and his thoughts from a bird's eye view of the LSU Tigers for 2025. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Game Time. If you are attending an NFL playoff game or want to, the energy is like no other. The excitement, the connection with the other fans, it's unmatched. I've been to plenty of NFL playoff games, both as fan and media, and there is very few things in sports quite like it. Being there for NFC Championship games with the Saints, watching the 2006 divisional round playoff game in the Dome when the Saints beat the Eagles to punch their ticket to the NFC Championship game, nothing like it. And this year, Game Time makes it even easier to create those unforgettable moments with their new feature, Game Time Picks. It filters out the fluff. It shows you only the best deals on great seats so you can focus on what matters, being there. You got to take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Use Game Time tickets to grab tickets for that upcoming playoff game. If it's the AFC NFC Championship game, or if it is the big game in NOLA coming up in a few Sundays, the super deal will give you incredible value for amazing seats. You can even preview the view from your spot before you buy your ticket. So check it out. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use the code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem with the code LOCKEDONCOLLEGE for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest prices guaranteed. Hard to believe. especially with snow on the ground in Baton Rouge this week. But LSU baseball is almost upon us. As we record this episode, Friday, January the 24th, the LSU baseball Tigers hit the practice field for the first time in advance of the 2025 season, just 3 weeks from the opener. I had the chance to visit with Kendall Rogers of D1 Baseball, really the preeminent media voice in college baseball. If you're not familiar with Kendall's work, you should be. You need to follow him on Twitter. And of course, you can go subscribe over at d1baseball.com. But had a chance to talk to Kendall for a good 15-minute chat on my radio show, After Further Review. If you'd like to hear the full conversation, you can. Just search After Further Review on YouTube or podcast, and you'll see it there. But there's a few bites that I wanted you to hear from Kendall. And first of all was his 10,000-foot overview on this LSU baseball team. Again, coming from a guy that saw LSU practice in the fall and certainly in the work that he does as a scout and evaluator, knows not just the LSU players, but the incoming players, these transfers that are in, the freshmen that are here, and what else LSU is up against in the 2025 season in the SEC. Here was the overview of the Tigers.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing for me is when I look at this team overall, it just looks like a club that, has balance. It's not a team that is very heavy offensive. And then when you look at the pitching staff, like a couple of years ago, granted that team won the championship, but it's like outside of Paul and a couple other guys, like the pitching staff was very vanilla and just pretty average. I feel like this is the team where I think as the season progresses, the offense is going to be really good. And I think at the start of the season, the pitching staff is going to be really good. So this is a very much a sum of its all parts kind of club. And I think by probably the middle of the year, this is going to be a national championship caliber club. The biggest thing for me is, can Cade Anderson be the Friday night guy we all think he can be? Does Anthony Ianson make that transition that we all, again, electric stuff, but can he make that transition like we all think he can be? So there are some question marks to this team, like anybody in the country, but the upside with this club is massive.
So interesting there with Kendall mentioned a couple of the arms. Cade Anderson, you might remember a year ago as a freshman, the lefty from St. Paul's, was absolutely sensational in non-conference action when he pitched, in the midweek. Whenever he started to get his opportunities in SEC play, it was just very clearly not there for him. He started off pitching at Central Arkansas, Rice, Southeastern, North Dakota State, was really good. His first SEC action was at Mississippi State. He went only 2/3 of an inning, gave up 3 hits and walked 1 and 5 batters faced. It just never really clicked for Cade against SEC pitching, but he's a lefty that could be a front of the weekend guy. Ianson, as you heard right there, was the number 1 pitching transfer in the country in this transfer portal cycle. So this is a guy that LSU no doubt is looking at with Anthony Ianson and saying, could that be a guy that is a weekend rotation guy for LSU? And one of the things Kendall mentioned is, it could be a thing where Cade Anderson and Shea Shores are your first two, and Ianson, who might be a front of the rotation guy anywhere else, ends up being your number 3 on an SEC weekend. 6'2", 208 out of UC San Diego, pitched for Team USA this summer. Can't wait to see Anthony Ianson, a big, strong arm righty, get out there and chuck it a little bit. There's so many others. If it's Connor Ware transferring in, Zach Cohen coming in from Wofford, and that's not even to talk about a guy like William Schmidt, who was a guy who could have signed for millions of dollars out of Catholic High in Baton Rouge, and maybe by the middle of this, maybe he follows a similar path as Aaron Nola, a guy who was a midweek guy until you couldn't help but keep him out of the weekends in some capacity. So maybe that's a path he follows. But LSU has no shortage of arms, which is a great thing. Now, offensively, I asked Kendall about Bear Jones. And Jones coming back is a huge plus for LSU. You put a guy who had 28 homers last year in the middle of your lineup, and that's a good thing. But the question about Jones is if he has protection. Because when Tommy White was batting in front of Bear Jones last year, you had to pick your poison. You're going to pitch to White, you're going to pitch to Jones. Similar with when you had Dylan Cruz and Tommy White. Pick your poison. Who are you going to pick to? I mean, there were times pitchers would walk Dylan Cruz to get to Tommy White, who led the nation in RBI. Like, you intentionally walked a guy to get to the RBI leader. There's no good answer. So is that protection there this year for Bear Jones?
Yeah, absolutely, going to have that kind of protection. I mean, I think you look up and down this lineup. My pick to click for this team is Jake Brown. I think we all kind of saw his potential last year in the fall. I think he's going to have a big bounce back year from last year. And granted, he wasn't like awful last year, but I mean, the talent level with Jake Brown is a lot better than 264. I think you look up and down the lineup. Michael Braswell's not going to blow you away as a hitter, but again, he's a solid piece down lineup. And then Monster Milam and Daniel Dickinson and Luis Hernandez from Indiana State. I've seen Luis numerous times in person, and he's a big-time power hitter. And it sounds like he actually made a pretty good transition in the fall. So there are enough pieces there to protect him. And somebody had reached out to me a couple weeks ago and said that he wasn't on someone's like top 100 juniors list, and I couldn't believe that because I think when you look at his evolution as a hitter, a lot less swing and miss as of late. Big time power, hit for an average last year. Had some big hits down the stretch at the end of last season. I think Bear's going to have a big season. I think he's going to have plenty of protection.
Jones did hit 300 each of his seasons in Baton Rouge. So Kendall's right. The power is there, but it's not like it's a homer or a strikeout. It's there is hit for average there as well if he's hitting 300. Mentioned Jake Brown as his pick to click. Jake Brown, of course, came in as the number one player in Louisiana. We do suspect he may get on the bump a little bit this year, again, throwing from the left side. But Brown hit 264 in his freshman season, but he started to come on late, which was kind of interesting to see. The more sort of comfortable that Jake Brown got as the season went along, that was really good to see. That later in the season, toward the postseason, you started to see Jake Brown really perform well, and especially there in the postseason. As we mentioned, he had a 3-hit game against South Carolina in the regional. He had a 2-for-4 day against Wofford. He was 4-for-4 against North Carolina. So just good to see Jake Brown have. I'm sorry, he was 1-for-4 with 4 bases. Forgive me, but it was good to see Jake Brown late in the season start to find his groove because he's going to be an everyday player for this team and a really good one. The other thing that I asked Kendall is, okay, if LSU is this talented, but you have them preseason at D1 baseball number 3 in the country, who's better in the SEC than LSU as they push off from the dock?
Probably just A&M. I mean, it's interesting because, naturally people go, what about Tennessee? But I think when you look at Tennessee, they're replacing a lot from a pitching standpoint. So I think that's a huge question mark for me. I would say the only team is probably just A&M. I mean, thanks to NIL, but I mean, they've got the best team that I would say, to some degree money can buy. I mean, they're absolutely loaded offensively. They're loaded on the mound. I mean, they had a guy in Ryan Prager who turned down $1.3 million because of NIL to go back to A&M for another season for a chance to win the program's first national title. So I would just say A&M right now. LSU, what's really interesting is LSU might actually be a little bit more balanced by season's end. I'd actually feel a little bit better about LSU's overall pitching than I do A&M's right now, but just A&M's offensive lineup. I mean, they're going to set all sorts of offensive records in the modern era this year, I think.
That is a mouthful, considering we saw a couple of years ago a Tennessee team that didn't win the national championship. We saw a Tennessee team that was maybe the best offensive team that we've ever seen in college baseball history. But here, just a couple of years later, Kendall saying you might see the same thing with Texas A&M. But maybe more balanced LSU team. Either way, you expect a plethora of SEC teams competing in the postseason as always, and LSU going to be chief among them. Can this roster come together? That process begins on Friday with practice at the box. We'll continue our series as well, previewing the Tigers with former Tiger great Ryan Theriot. If you missed last week's preview, we looked at the infield. Coming up this week, on the next episode, we'll look at the outfield. So make sure you're here for that. If you missed any of those, we'll give you the previews as we count down toward LSU's opener against Purdue Fort Wayne at the box on Valentine's Day. All right, we'll wrap up next. Locked on LSU. It's your team every day. Before we get out of here, quick thumbnail preview of LSU and South Carolina in women's basketball. This is one that has been a real bugaboo for LSU. All time, the Tigers are 12-17 against South Carolina. And it has been a hot minute since LSU's been able to upend Dawn Staley's team. Under Kim Mulkey, LSU is yet to beat South Carolina, losing to them last year in the SEC Tournament Championship and in the regular season in a close game. Lost, in Baton Rouge last year, 2 years ago, lost a lopsided game in Columbia, and in Kim Mulkey's first year, the Tigers put up a great fight, but came up just short against the Gamecocks. And this is going to be a real challenge. The last two national champions, of course, South Carolina last year, they're 18-1, 6-0 in the league. LSU 20-0. 5-0 in the SEC, so LSU just a half game in the conference standings behind South Carolina. Tigers got to go on the road for this one. They're in Columbia, and this is a South Carolina team that is 9-0 at home this year, and they're sixth in the SEC in scoring at 82 points per game, shooting 47% from the floor. LSU 5-0 in league play, and they are second in the SEC with 15 offensive rebounds per game, of course, led by the great Anissa Morrow. So can LSU crash the glass and get those second chance points? The game in the game here is going to be for LSU, in my opinion, on the defensive end. I mentioned South Carolina averages 82 points a game. LSU allows 62 points a game. So there is a 20-point gap there between LSU's defense and South Carolina's scoring offense. So can LSU defensively hold South Carolina under 80 points? The closer they can get to their points allowed average is going to be the telltale in this game. Does South Carolina get to their 82 average? Does LSU hold South Carolina close to the 62 average? We've seen this game in this series go several different ways as they played the past couple of seasons. The game that they played in the regular season when LSU lost to number one South Carolina, that was 76-70, where LSU was, in control of that game in the first half, and then South Carolina wrestled it away late. At the SEC Tournament Championship, that was a 79-72 win for South Carolina. So a couple of games that didn't get to the 80s, but of course LSU wants to keep it lower scoring than obviously being in the upper 70s or the 80s. So for LSU, a great opportunity as they go on the road to Carolina. And as we mentioned, one of the other things that's important about this ball game is this is a South Carolina game, LSU South Carolina, that was supposed to be played on Thursday in prime time on ESPN. College Game Day was supposed to be there for the first time on campus for a women's college basketball game this year. And a lot of that aura, a lot of that environment, a lot of that pomp and circumstance has now been removed. The game, of course, had to be postponed today because of weather. And so now College Game Day won't be there. The game will be played at 4:00. So you may not have quite the crowd you would have on a primetime game with College Game Day there and everything else. So maybe a little bit less environment plays in LSU's favor, not quite as hostile as they would have gone into. And ultimately, LSU is going to have to find a way to get over this hump with South Carolina. You're going to have to find a way to beat that team. That has been the premier team in the Southeastern Conference, not all of college basketball, since Dawn Staley has been there. And LSU is going to have to find a way to scale that mountain. And we'll see if they can do it in Columbia on Friday. It's LSU in South Carolina. It's a 4:00 tip. It is televised on ESPN. And we'll certainly talk about how it goes when we're back here on Locked On LSU. Hey, thanks so much for making this your first listen every day. Now, for your second listen, go check out my guy Chris Gordy for Locked On SEC on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. If you are on podcasts, thanks so much. Please subscribe on your favorite podcast app. Rate us, leave a review. If you're on YouTube, please smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell so you're notified whenever we post a new video, and let a friend know if they love the Tigers. We got you here every single day for Locked On LSU, your team every day.